Before we get into that, can I just ask you, issue of the morning, should children aged 12 and over be vaccinated as quickly as possible?
Well, clearly, the medicines regulator has now said that it's safe for children between 12 and 15 to receive the vaccination. But I think there's still a cost benefit analysis, if you like, to do, because, of course, giving vaccines to anyone, and especially to younger children, isn't going to be completely without some degree of risk. And so I guess the question is the risk outweighed by the benefits? Now, we know that children and young people themselves are not susceptible really to severe illness or um, thankfully, death from COVID. So the question is really about to what extent would it help slow the spread of infection among the wider population? And that is a very fine balance. And I think we've got to wait to see what the JCVI says about that. I think it's right, as things stand, that we wait for that advice, but it's clearly a balanced decision and not a straightforward one.
Do you think some parents will be nervous about vaccinating 12, 13, 14-year-olds with a relatively new vaccine like this?
Yes, I do. In fact, I've been asking parents in my own family this question, and they are very, very cautious, I think it's fair to say, but very keen to do the right thing, not just for their own family, but for the wider community. So I think the more information, the more transparent we can be in getting information out to people about how the safety has been assessed and what balancing factors have been taken into account, the more it should be possible to try to reassure people. And I heard a few moments ago your reporter saying that it would be, in any case, not compulsory for children aged 12 to 15 to receive the vaccine. So, of course, parents do have the right to make that decision for their own children.
We're seeing global leaders meet in the UK this week to discuss a sort of global vaccine effort. Some people might say that rather than jabbing 12, 13-year-olds who are very unlikely to get seriously ill from COVID, we should be sending these doses abroad to older people in developing countries where they've hardly got any vaccines at all. Do you think there's a case for that instead?
I was actually very pleased to hear the Prime Minister saying at the G7 that we should be championing the rolling out of vaccines, particularly to those developing countries that have been struggling to get vaccination programs up and running. Because as we know, none of us is safe until everyone in the world is safe. And of course, we have a moral responsibility as members of the global community to make sure that we share the great success that we've had in this country, thanks to our NHS and wonderful scientists, as far as we can around the world. So I do think it's right to give a lot of priority now to supporting those countries that have less secure health systems, that are perhaps really struggling to vaccinate very vulnerable people. And I'm very glad that the G7 and our Prime Minister has said that that should be a priority, with the ambition of vaccinating the whole world by 2022. That's something I strongly
But
support.
should we do it now? That's the question. Should we be doing it now with vaccines that might otherwise be going to much younger people in this country?
I think if I may say so, a really urgent priority in this country, Jack, is in those areas where we've got a surge in infections, this Delta variant. For example, close to me in Greater Manchester, we have the issue in Bolton of quite a rise in infections, and that's true in other parts of our country too. So I think there is a priority for surge vaccination programs in this country, in those areas where we've got high rates of infection. I think we've got to wait to see from the JCVI what the balance of risk and benefit is from vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds in this country. But I do think it is really important that we recognise, as members of the global community, and in a very interconnected world, where people are still going to keep travelling around and interacting with those from every other country in the world, it is really important that we bring forward a plan to vaccinate the whole world. And I think that's a good decision by the G7.
Okay. Now you've called this vote in Parliament this week on the government's COVID catch-up plan for kids in schools. Do you have the votes you need, the support on the Tory backbenches to actually win this vote, do you think?
Well, I hope Conservative MPs and indeed MPs from all parties will support us. And we have heard, for example, Robert Halfon, the Conservative chair of the Education Select Committee, criticising the government's plans as piecemeal. We've heard other Conservative MPs, Anne-Marie Morris, for example, asking if the Treasury even lives in the real world. And I think when you see such a gap between what the government's own expert education advisor, Kevin Collins, recommended and what the Chancellor of the Exchequer was actually prepared to cough up for. I very much hope we will see Conservative MPs and MPs from all parties supporting us in the vote this week. Because, every political party has said, Boris Johnson said, Keir Starmer has absolutely said, children and young people must be our top priority. But, it turns out to be a completely hollow promise when Boris Johnson will not lift a finger to say to his Chancellor, this is my number one priority, and we need to make sure that we have the resources to deliver the education and other activities that children and young people need to bounce back from the pandemic.
Well, in fairness, they're putting in an extra £1.5 billion on top of the whatever it was, £1.5 billion they'd already announced. I mean, some people might just be rolling their eyes saying Labour's answer is always just spend, spend, spend. And at some point, we're going to have to start paying this money back, aren't we?
Well, it's about priorities, isn't it? And we know that the government has quite rightly set aside a COVID reserve fund to help get the country as a whole back on its feet after the pandemic. And there will be many different things that will need to be addressed, our care system, getting businesses and the economy working again. But you would expect me as the Shadow Education Secretary to say that children and young people must be our top priority. We owe it to them as adults. We have a responsibility as adults to make sure that they have the best childhoods, that they can fulfill their potential. And our package of proposals addresses both their lost learning and the emotional and social well-being that parents and teachers have been telling us is so important. And of course, there's a cost of not making this investment in children and young people now. So our proposals for catch-up tutoring and for more money for schools to support those children who need extra attention, for extra activities at the end of the school day, for children to socialise and develop together, for support for teacher training and a range of other measures. Our package, which we've costed at £14.7 billion, really is a small fraction of what economists are saying could be the cost to the country as a whole in lost earnings, lost productivity and so on, of hundreds of billions of pounds. So I'm afraid, I think the very meagre £1.5 billion that the government is proposing falls way short of what is needed, and in fact is a false economy. It's the wrong choice to be making.
It strikes me it's pretty damaging for the government that their own education advisor has resigned over this, and it comes after a pretty damaging testimony by the Prime Minister's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, about the way the government handled the pandemic last year. And yet, for all that, the latest opinion poll put Labour 16 points behind the government in terms of public support. Why is no one listening to you?
It's really tough for us, if I'm honest, Jack, to see those polls. And I think people are naturally very anxious to see us get through this pandemic, and everybody wants to support, and indeed we have wanted to support the government to do the right thing, to make sure that we can address this terrible pandemic, support families, support our communities and our economy. And I understand that in a time of national and international crisis, people don't want to be playing politics and seeing political parties tearing lumps out of one another for the sake of it. We clearly have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust in Labour. It's clear many voters have felt that we aren't speaking to their concerns, and that's something that Keir Starmer has said he will spend this summer, when we hope very much he and we will be able to get out and about again and be with people, listening to those concerns and really understanding what it is that people are looking for from Labour. And it's clear people feel they haven't had the Labour Party that they wanted and deserved. And I think we've got to have the humility to listen to that. But we have our values, our principles, the things we stand for. And I don't think it's ever right, and I don't think it's ever credible with voters for us not to be absolutely honest about what it is we believe in and what it is we would aspire to do in government. And so I think that just playing to the gallery isn't the right way for any political party, and certainly not for us to be closing that gap. We've got to be having some very open and straight conversations with voters, and I'm looking forward to joining Keir Starmer and other colleagues in doing that over the summer.
But I mean, you talk about playing to the gallery. Keir Starmer had to resort to a tell-all interview with Piers Morgan last week. That was a sign of a desperate man, isn't it?
I thought it was an amazing interview, actually, incredibly brave. I don't think I could have done that, to have spoken so personally about what have obviously been some really tough times in his own family life. And I think people will have seen a real side of Keir that shows his values, his principles, why he believes in the politics that he does, and also a man who is incredibly strong and resilient in the face of challenging and adverse circumstances. And that's something I would certainly want in my future Prime Minister, someone who can cope when the going gets really tough and knows what he believes in. I also thought Keir came across as funny. He came across as really warm and likeable. And I think people will have really warmed to the huge care and importance that I think he places on his own family.
Okay.
So I thought it was a great interview, actually.